Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So lemma, but one can make one easy observation. So lemma, let omega inside C be a domain and let f be a branch of the logarithm. Then any other branch of the logarithm differs from f by a constant multiple of 2 pi I. So let gz be a branch of the logarithm, another branch of the logarithm, let's say. Then fz minus gz is a constant well, I should not say constant. So please ignore the word constant. Then fz minus gz is a multiple of 2 pi I for all z in omega. But the multiple may change depending on z. So at some point it may be 2 pi I, so at some other point it may be 4 pi I and so on. But it's a multiple of 2 pi I for all z inside omega. The word constant should be removed. I will make that correction. And since omega is connected and fz minus gz is continuous, while integral multiples of 2 pi I are a discrete set, it follows that fz minus gz is a constant multiple of 2 pi I. So finally the conclusion is that fz minus gz is a constant multiple of 2 pi I. At every point, the difference is a multiple of 2 pi I, right? But this multiple changes continuously with points in z, but the domain is connected, the codomain is discrete. From something connected to something discrete, the only continuous functions are constant. So it is a constant multiple of 2 pi I. So this is why in the first lecture we had stressed about path connectedness and so on. This is how it shows up. If it was not a domain, this conclusion would have been false. Because on one connected piece, it can be one multiple of 2 pi I, another connected piece, it can be another multiple of 2 pi I. Connectedness of omega is what guarantees that it's a constant multiple of 2 pi I. So we haven't defined connected. By connected, I just mean path connected. Connected, yeah, path, I use the word connected, but I really mean omega is path connected. Actually, the point is that there is a weaker notion in topology called connected, and actually connectedness is what is enough, but I don't want to get into all that. For open subsets, the notion of connected and path connectedness are equivalent. That is why in the first lecture I didn't fuss about connectedness and path connectedness and how they are different and so on, because we are only interested in complex analysis on open subsets where connectedness and path connectedness are the same. So I really mean omega is path connected here. So somebody is asking that why is continuous function from a path connected space to a discrete space constant? Because you see, suppose you take, so let me just quickly comment on this point. Suppose I have a path connected open set and I have a continuous function to some discrete set. Then I want to say it is constant. That's because suppose I take 2 points in that domain, and I want to prove that the values are the same at those 2 points. I can join those two by a path, continuous path, and then by continuity, at all points on that path, at nearby points, the values have to be the values that the function takes has to be nearby, right? But in discrete set, nearby means it really has to be the same value. Yeah, because discrete set means all those terms are separated by a certain distance away. So all along that path, all the nearby points are going to take the same value. So it's locally constant. So I can go from one part to another by little arcs, and on each of those arcs it is the same constant. So at the initial point and the final point also it is the same. Yeah, is this kind of okay? Is this explanation? Yeah, so this is a basic fact. Maybe I'll state it as a separate, make a small addition in the slides and state this fact separately, that from a path connected space to any discrete set, any continuous function is always constant. So we will usually work with a fixed branch of the logarithm, which is called the principal branch, and this is usually defined. This is defined as follows. So take omega inside C to be the open subset defined by C minus the negative real axis. The negative real axis including 0. Yeah, so throughout all the negative real numbers including 0, and for any z inside omega, z equal to mod z times e raised to I theta, theta will now vary strictly between minus pi and pi. Define fz equal to fz means the branch of the logarithm to be log of r plus I times theta. So this is log of mod z plus I times argument of z. So this is how I can define a branch of the logarithm on this particular open subset, this particular domain rather. Yeah, take C minus all the negative reals throughout all the negative reals throughout the origin on the complementary open set. I can define a branch of the logarithm simply by log of z equal to log of r plus I times theta. And one checks that fz is a branch of log z on omega. In fact, fz is analytic and f prime z is equal to 1 by z. For the moment, I will leave this little check-in to you to compute derivative of this log. Also because we are going to come back to it in greater detail once we discuss complex integration. So I'll leave it at that for the moment. So this is a branch of the logarithm. There are many different domains inside omega on which I can define a branch of the logarithm. This is one standard open set on which I can define a branch. You can, so okay, now let's come to the last para. One can show that log z is not defined as an analytic function on all of C star. So it is certainly log is not defined at 0, but even if you remove 0, you cannot define log as an analytic function. It can only be defined on certain nice open subsets of C star. We will come back to the logarithm in more detail after we discuss complex integration. Yeah, so this much is enough for the moment. But the reason why we are discussing all this branch, etc., is because if you take all non-zero complex numbers, you cannot define the logarithm. You have to take smaller open subsets, and only then you can define the logarithm. And the subset omega that I have described in this slide is one such open set. And on that, the branch of the logarithm is as I have defined. And now I leave it as an easy checking to check that to verify that this is analytic and its derivative is equal to 1 by z. So try proving this. At the moment, I am not proving analyticity of this and not checking the derivative. The reason is this will follow from what we are going to discuss anyway. That is why I am not discussing the proof at the moment. Okay, any questions so far?
This r is e to the log r. This fz is equal to log r plus I theta.
So this r is just the magnitude mod z.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Sorry, maybe I should have added that. So z is equal to r e raised to I theta. So you take log, this log of r plus I times theta. So log of r is mod z. R is mod z for me. This is the definition. And now it's clear. If you take why does this work as the inverse? Because if you take e raised to log of mod z plus I times argument of z, you can easily check that you get z again. Exponential of log mod z plus I times argument of z, what will it be? It will be e raised to log z times cos theta plus I sin theta, right? But e raised to log mod z is just mod z. So you'll get mod z times cos theta plus I sin theta. Yeah. It's immediate. I'm just saying it's immediate checking that this satisfies the property of the logarithm that we want, that it's the inverse of the exponential function. Yeah, is this clear? I'm just making the easy observation that that exponential of log mod z plus I times argument of z is equal to z again. Yeah, that is so somebody is asking how can we say fz is the branch of log z? That is what I just explained. Fz is the branch because e raised to fz is equal to z. What is e raised to fz? E raised to the power log z plus I times argument of z. This means this will be e raised to log mod z times cos of the argument of z plus I times sine of the argument of z. So that just means, but e raised to log of mod z is just mod z. So it's mod z times cos theta plus I sin theta. Just apply the definition. Okay. Now, in the remaining time, let us discuss another very beautiful theorem about analytic functions. Again, this will illustrate a very sharp contrast between real and complex analysis. So let omega be a domain in C, and let f from omega to C be a complex analytic function defined on omega. Again, just to quickly recall, this means that f can be expressed as a power series expanded around any point in omega. So I can locally expand f as a power series around every point. Now let z naught be a point in omega at which f vanishes. So we will show that f is identically 0, or there exists a neighborhood of z naught on which f has no other 0. That is to say that the zeros of f are a discrete set. Yeah, if you have a 0 at some point, then there are two possibilities. Either the function is identically 0 in a neighborhood of that point, or the function is has no other 0 in a small neighborhood. So it's either identically 0 or it is discrete. So the only two possibilities for zeros of an analytic function. So this is a proof. So just pay a little, the proof may appear just a little tricky. So pay careful attention. So I want to prove this theorem. It's very nice, very beautiful fact. So assume the contrary. So then f is a non-zero function on which there exists a sequence of points zn converging to z0, so that f vanishes along this sequence. Yeah, I'm assuming the contrary. So the proof is by contradiction. I'm already assuming that f is a non-zero function. So the only other possibility was discrete set. Suppose it is not a discrete set. If it is not a discrete set, that means there is a sequence of points zn in the complex plane and which converges to a point z0, such that f vanishes along this sequence. Suppose you have this situation. I want to arrive at a contradiction. So we will show that all the derivatives of f at z0 are 0. And if all the derivatives are 0, then when you expand the function using power series, convergent power series, the function will also be identically 0. That will be a contradiction. So is the strategy clear? How we are going to go about proving it? I'm assuming the contrary. Then I will know that I have a sequence of points converging, sequence of points z0 converging to a point z0, so that the function vanishes along this sequence. And then using that, I will prove that all derivatives at z0 are identically 0, which by analyticity of the function will conclude that the function itself is identically 0 in a neighborhood of z0.
What do you mean by f vanishes along this sequence? Does it mean that the limit of f is 0 as z goes to z0?
No. It means that f is 0 at all points on this sequence.
Sir, we're writing fk z0, that's f of z0 raised to the power k, right?
No. Kth derivative.
Oh, sorry, k. Okay. Yeah, fine.
Okay. So I hope the strategy is clear. Now let's chalk out the details. So without loss of generality, we can assume that this open set contains 0 and z0 is equal to 0. Yeah. Simply by translating the function, translating the point, translating the function, I can always assume that this z0 is equal to 0. That's the first reduction. So let n be the largest natural number, so that ith derivative at 0 is equal to 0 for all I less than or equal to n. So suppose, so suppose all derivatives at z0 are 0, all derivatives are 0, z0 is now become 0. So suppose all derivatives at 0 are 0, then we are done, we can go home. Suppose not, then there will be a largest natural number, so that all derivatives before that are 0. So then f can be expanded in a neighborhood as fz is equal to z raised to n plus 1 upon n plus 1 factorial times n plus first derivative at 0 plus z raised to n plus 2 upon n plus 2 factorial n plus 2th derivative at 0 and so on. This is the power series expansion. The first few terms are 0 because the derivatives at 0 are 0. First n derivatives are 0. So the first 0 onward, 0 to n, all the derivatives are 0. So the first n plus 1 terms in this power series are 0. So the series expansion starts with z raised to n plus 1. So you have this power series. So I'll take z raised to n plus 1 outside. So this is z raised to n plus 1 times nth derivative, n plus first derivative at 0 upon n plus 1 factorial plus z upon n plus 2 factorial times n plus 2th derivative at 0 and so on. Just taking z to the power n plus 1 outside. So any doubt so far?
N can even be 1 here, right?
Yeah, n can even be 1, sure. Well, n can even be 0, in fact. Well, actually, yeah, n will be forced to be 1 because along the sequence the function is vanishing. So n will at least be 1. But you can be generous and even allow n to be 0.
Sir, can you explain the term vanishes?
We had
Sorry?
f of z not equal to 0, right? We had
Yeah.
f of z naught is equal to 0, so n
Yeah.
can't be 0.
Why can't n be 0? That means the zeroth derivative, the value of the function is the zeroth derivative.
Sir,
Okay. Yeah.
can you explain the term vanishes, like the line?
Vanishes simply means is 0. A function vanishes at a point means the function is 0 at the point.
Sir, why is f to power k means k derivative of f at z naught is 0?
No. See, if the value of the function at z naught is 0. So z naught itself is 0. First of all, now we have changed. We have assumed that z naught is 0. So f of 0 is certainly 0. But some more derivatives at 0 could be 0, right? I'm only assuming that n. Your question was why n the largest natural number? Is that what you're asking? Can you
No, sir,
repeat?
I said why the k derivative of f at z naught is 0.
No, I'm not saying.
It's written
No,
we
I'm not
show
saying that. I'm saying we will show that.
Okay.
That's the ultimate aim, to show that all the kth derivatives are 0. We are not assuming that, no. So okay, so far we have not done much of hard work. We still need to main work is still remaining. Okay. Now notice that as z tends to 0 along the sequence Zn, we see that the left hand side is identically 0. Yeah, f of Zn is 0. So the left hand side is identically 0 along Zn. Hence the right hand side also vanishes identically along this sequence. Hence the term inside the bracket vanishes along Zn. Yeah. Why does? Because you have z raised to n plus 1 times something, and that vanishes along Zn. But Zn is a sequence of non-zero numbers. So Zn to the power n plus 1 is non-zero, but that times whatever is inside the bracket is 0. So the only way that's possible is whatever is inside the bracket is 0 along Zn. Yeah, Zn's are non-zero, converging to 0. Zn is a sequence of complex numbers converging to 0. So you can assume each of these Zn's is non-zero. But when I put in z equal to Zn, the right hand side vanishes identically. But Zn to the power n plus 1 is not 0. So product of two things is 0, then one of them has to be 0. The term outside the bracket is not 0, so the term inside the bracket has to be 0. So whatever you have inside the bracket vanishes along Zn. Yeah, so hence the term inside the bracket vanishes along Zn, and hence by continuity it vanishes at the limit, namely 0. Therefore showing that the n plus first derivative at 0 is equal to 0. Yeah, so Zn, so the term inside the bracket vanishes along Zn. By continuity it will also vanish at the limit, but the limit of Zn is 0, so the term inside the bracket also vanishes at z equal to 0. But what happens when you substitute z equal to 0 for the term for the terms inside the bracket? All the other terms vanish, and you will be left with nth derivative at n plus first derivative at 0 equal to 0. But this contradicts the maximality assumption on z, thereby completing the proof. N was the largest number, so that the first n derivatives are 0. But now we have shown that the n plus first derivative is also 0. So that contradicts the maximality assumption on n, thereby completing the proof. Is the proof clear? Maybe I will go over it slowly again. But
Why can't the sum of those numbers be 0? They are not all positive like in the real sense.
No. Okay. So let me just go over the argument slowly once again, and that will also answer your question. See, I know that along Zn the left hand side is 0. Therefore, along Zn the right hand side is also 0. But the term outside the bracket, which is z raised to n plus 1, this is not 0 along Zn. So therefore, the term inside the bracket is 0 along Zn. Yeah.
Okay, z to the n plus 1 is not 0 along Zn,
Yeah.
but the sum can be 0.
No.
Or-
Let me go systematically. Wait, your question will get answered. Zn to the power n plus 1, z raised to n plus 1 is not 0 along Zn. So the term inside the bracket is 0 along Zn. So the sum of all those guys vanishes along Zn. Therefore, they also vanish at the limit. If they vanish along Zn, they also vanish at the limit of Zn, namely 0. So the term inside the bracket also vanishes at 0. Yeah, but when you put z equal to 0 inside the bracket, the second term onwards, all of them are anyway 0. So the first term is also 0. And therefore the n plus first derivative is 0. Yeah, so I'm making three statements.
Oh yes, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, I'm making three statements. The right hand side is 0 along Zn. Therefore, the term inside the bracket is 0 along Zn. Therefore, the terms inside the bracket are also 0 in the limit, which is 0. So the terms inside the bracket vanish when you not the individual terms, but the sum of all those terms vanish when you put z equal to 0. But when you put z equal to 0, the second term onwards, anyway they are 0. So the first term is 0. First term 0 means n plus first derivative at 0 is equal to 0. That contradicts the assumption on n. N was the maximum number such that all derivatives up to that are 0. So now we have also proved that n plus first derivative is 0. So this contradicts the maximality assumption on n, thereby completing the proof. So therefore all derivatives at 0 are 0. Since all derivatives at 0 are 0, when you expand around the power series, the function itself is 0. Yeah, so this is a beautiful theorem really, that the zeros of a holomorphic function are isolated. Is the proof clear? Let me pause for this, since this was maybe a touch tricky. Let me pause for a minute and take questions. But really, I mean, it's best that you think about it yourself. I've already explained all the steps. Now just go back and put some thought into it. I remember when I first saw this, I was a little excited. Okay, so I'll go on. Please think about this. Proof is not difficult at all. Very nice proof. And so there is something in the chat box. Does z raised to n plus 1 tend to 0? Well, z raised to n plus 1 of course tends to 0 as z tends to 0. So that's not a problem. But really what is important for us in the argument is that the term inside the bracket tend to 0 as z tends to 0. I mean, it's also true that z raised to n plus 1 tends to 0 as z tends to 0.
If it's z raised to n plus 10 to 0, I didn't understand how we can continue with the proof.
No, we can continue with the proof because the term in z raised to n plus 1 does tend to 0 as n tends to 0, as z tends to 0. That is correct. But z raised to n plus 1 does not vanish along Zn. That is the key point. Yeah, but the product is identically 0 along Zn. So therefore the terms inside the bracket are identically 0. So the sum of the terms inside the bracket is identically 0 along Zn. Since it is identically 0 along Zn, it is also 0 at 0 by taking limits. But when you put z equal to 0, second term onwards, anyway everything is 0, so the first term is 0. So z raised to n plus 1 tending to 0 is fine, but it does not tend to 0 along, but it is not equal to 0 along Zn. Okay, so let me go ahead. Think about this point. If it's still not clear, ask me later. One could ask if the converse is true, namely given a discrete set of points going to infinity, does there exist a holomorphic function with the property that it vanishes exactly on this set? Yeah, and indeed this is true. Take any discrete set of points going to infinity, you can find a holomorphic function which vanishes exactly on that set. So in fact, something more is true. You can make it vanish along prescribed multiplicities. One can find a holomorphic function vanishing exactly on any discrete set with prescribed vanishing multiplicities at those points. So you can make it vanish at the first point to order 13, vanish at the second point to order 20, and so on. What do I mean by vanishing up to a given order? Those many terms in the Taylor series are 0. So vanishing to order 20 means the Taylor series will start with the 21st term. So this is called the Weierstrass product theorem. It's the same. Yeah.
Is this function not just a polynomial whose zeros are the elements of the set?
No, polynomial will only vanish at finite set. How can the polynomial vanish along any discrete set?
This holds for infinite sets as well.
Yeah. Any discrete set going to infinity. That is the point. If it was polynomial, then it's much easier. Any discrete set. This is called the Weierstrass product theorem. Yeah, but when you try to get bigger and bigger things, there'll be convergence issues and so on. You want a convergent power series. Yeah, you can sort of think of adding various things or multiplying various things, but you have to ensuring convergence is not so easy. It is a non-trivial theorem. It's not. So this is called, yeah. So of course, this is named after this German mathematician Karl Weierstrass, was an important mathematician of the 19th century, and he was responsible for putting analysis on rigorous footing. Analysis sort of or calculus, starting with Newton and coming up to Weierstrass, a lot of it was on shaky footing, and Weierstrass made a lot of it rigorous. In particular, the epsilon delta definition of limit was formulated by Weierstrass. Okay, now I want to explain the contrast with the real case. Yeah, anytime we study something in complex analysis, we should compare and contrast with what happens in real analysis or calculus. So note that this property that we had just explained, this fails for real differentiable functions. Which property am I talking about? Namely the zeros being discrete. Function are also isolated, or also a discrete set. However, for infinitely differentiable functions, this is not true. So let's take last time's function again. Take the function fx, which is equal to e raised to minus 1 by x when x is positive and equal to 0 when x is negative. And not just negative, less than or equal to 0 really. This is infinitely differentiable, but it vanishes along the entire negative real axis. Yeah. Along the entire negative real axis, this infinitely differentiable real function is 0. So this theorem that we just now proved, it fails completely for real differentiable functions. In fact, even for infinitely differentiable real functions. And once we prove that holomorphic functions are analytic as well, the above fact will also hold for holomorphic functions. So right now we are assuming analytic and proving it. We will prove maybe 2 lectures from now, the next to next lecture, holomorphic functions are also analytic. And once we do that, the same property that zeros are discrete will hold for holomorphic functions as well. Yeah, I hope the point that I'm trying to make in this slide is clear. I'm trying to compare and compare analytic functions, whether it's real analytic or complex analytic, doesn't matter, with C infinity functions. C infinity is what we mean by infinitely differentiable. So C infinity functions is what I'm comparing with real analytic functions or complex analytic functions. And the theorem that we just discussed illustrates a very stark contrast. I should perhaps remark that this function e raised to minus 1 by x per x positive and 0 when x is non-positive. This is a very important function. It may appear that I'm using this as some kind of a pathological example to illustrate how things go wrong, but actually the function has many uses as well. I cannot go into that because that's a topic of separate discussion, but this function and functions that are other functions that are manufactured using this function are very useful in convolutions. There's a process in analysis called convolutions, and when you convolve ordinary functions with certain functions that you get out of this function, you have many nice properties. So this function is very important and allows one to prove various sort of density theorems in analysis. I cannot go into any of that in this course, but I just want to remark that this is not just a pathology, it has a lot of uses. Okay, so this completes the discussion for the day. I'll just end by stating a number of exercises relevant to this lecture to define all the various other trigonometric functions that you know, cosec x and so on, sec, cosec, all of them can be defined. Show that, second exercise is that show that the exponential function from C to C star is onto. Is it one-to-one? This is something we have already discussed. It's not one-to-one. Third exercise, show that sine and cos from C to C star are surjective. In particular, note that the difference between the real sine and cosine Yeah, notice that again this illustrates very sharp contrast with real analysis. In real analysis, the real function sine and cos, they are always bounded by 1, right? Sine sine and cosine vary between 1 and -1, but here the sine from C to when you think of sine and cosine as functions of the complex variable, they are surjective functions from C to C, not just unbounded, they are surjective. Fourth example, show that sine square z plus cos square z is 1. So this remains same. And not just sine square z plus cos square z is 1. Look at all the other trigonometric identities. All of them hold here as well. Then fifth example, sine of z plus w is sine z cos w plus cos z sine w. Cos of z plus w is cos z cos w minus sine z sine w. All these identities hold here as well. So these are the exercises. I'll include, I think, almost all of them or all of them in the next tutorial. And I'll stop.